All right. Hey, welcome everyone. If it's your first time joining us here, thank you so much for being here, and everyone else, welcome back. Glad to have you. Let us know where you're coming from in the chat. Say hello, introduce yourselves. I'm Anna Brazetite. I'm the Education Director at Christina T. Miller Sustainable Jewelry Consulting, where we provide strategy, guidance, and education on responsible sourcing and sustainability for the jewelry industry. If you'd like to find out more, you can find out some more information about us on our website. We'll put that in the chat. This is the living room. It's an informal virtual hangout to support community and connection on issues related to responsible sourcing in jewelry. We cover different topics every month, and we love to hear your feedback. So if you have ideas for a topic you'd like to discuss or anything else you'd like to share with us, you can use our feedback form that we'll put in the chat as well. So thank you all for showing up to have this conversation today, and an extra thank you to those who were able to contribute with the pay what you want option. We're so happy to be able to provide these sessions for you. So thanks for helping us make that possible. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. We are recording this session, so these videos will be in the public realm. You're welcome to speak up. You can ask questions, put them in the chat. When you're not speaking, please do stay muted for better sound quality all around. If you're sending a private message or using the chat throughout, please keep it kind. Make sure private chats are respectful of participants' privacy and personal space. Make sure you subscribe to our email list as well. Our next living room session will be on May 20th. Oh, sorry, is it the 19th? It's the third Friday. So I have the wrong date there. 20th, that's correct. So they're the third Friday of the month. And now I'll hand it over to Christina.
Excellent, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. And I'd like to acknowledge first and foremost our scheduling failure for this session. We are committed to every third Friday of the month, and we did that without really looking at global holidays. And so our apologies for the insensitivity. We're gonna do better next time. So thank you everyone that can make it. Maybe for some of you, it means it's easier to attend. I'm not sure. So thank you. As Anna mentioned, this session is being recorded. So the last time we got together, we were talking about development strategies that are integral to artisanal and small scale mining. And that important work is severely hindered by multiple forms of conflict, which don't stop the flow of materials, but can severely shift who is benefiting. So today's discussion came about as a result of the Russian war on Ukraine and of all the commercial ventures helping to fund Putin's war, including diamond and gold sales. The US government has continued tightening sanctions on Russian companies like Alrosa, which is part of the Russian government. Internationally, we are being forced to reckon with loopholes in the diamond supply chains that make it very difficult to determine a diamond's origin. An origin is the bare minimum piece of information that we have to know in order to be able to discern the impacts of our sourcing decisions. Without this information of actual origin, we aren't truly able to deduce whether including or excluding a diamond from our purchases aligns with our values. So very quickly after alarms were raised about diamonds mined in Russia, the view was then expanded to diamonds mined in Angola by Alrosa, and additionally into areas where Russian influence has been stirring up conflict for a long time, like the Central African Republic. So in short order, the cracks in the system became a more common topic of conversation, and further questions arose about the limitations of the sanctions and the way diamonds move through India, China, Belgium, and Israel, and about the cutting and polishing and the reality that substantially transforming a stone in a country other than where the stone was mined changes its reported origin. So this brings us to today's living room. Many of you and others raised an additional question. Why is everyone ignoring other regions of the world where funding from diamonds perpetuates violence, corruption, environmental impacts, and more? We heard the criticism and think this is a fair question to ask and explore. So we wanted to widen the scope with all of you and with our guests. So today we're going to journey through the conversation about Alrosa, about Russia, about the role of the trade globally, and about how occupied communities are managing. Our hope is that with broader and deeper knowledge, we will be able to identify solutions that can be local as well as systemic. As always, we are all here to learn, work through the information together. So as this discussion progresses, the big picture we are striving for is what to do. If the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme was the catalyst for the limited scope of the word conflict relative to diamonds, and we're calling for an end to using that word in this way, then what do we replace it with? What is the new paradigm for diamonds that we are trying to establish? So it's my great pleasure to welcome Susan Wheeler and Brad Brooks Rubin. I'll let each of them introduce themselves a little bit more, but Susan is the owner of Susan Wheeler Design, is the founder of the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference, as well as the Responsible Jewelry Transformative. Brad Brooks Rubin has a history working in the field, currently is with the Century, and will share a little bit more about his current work. So Susan, if you would just give a quick introduction about yourself, and then we'll get started. We'll introduce you and Brad, and then we'll get to our questions.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Christina, and thanks for having me on today. Yes, I'm Susan Wheeler, and I have the Responsible Jewelry Transformative, which is a nonprofit. And under that nonprofit, we support the Moringi Women's Alliance, which is a community-based organization in Moringi, Zimbabwe. And that came about through me first kind of covering human rights and diamonds 2 years ago in November, and working with Human Rights Watch to have a diamond symposium. And we've been working together ever since, and now they have a strong women's community-based organization. And also at the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference this year, we covered structures that included diamonds that are government owned, as well as talking about the Katoka River spill in the Congo River Basin that started at a diamond mine in Angola. So those are some areas that I'd like to touch on that we've been talking about, but as you said, some of these areas haven't had a light on them as much as, trying. So thank you so much for having me on and discussing these issues.
Yeah, thank you for having me as well. It's an honor to be here with Susan and all of you. It's also a pleasure to see a number of familiar friends on the line. I've been around this sector, I guess, in different ways for 15 years, I guess. I worked at the Treasury Department's Sanctions Office, which is now an office that a lot more people know about. But I worked there in the late 2000s, working on a range of sub-Saharan African sanctions programs, including a number that related to diamonds and gold and others. That got me interested in the subject. I moved to the State Department, where I worked from 2009 to 2013 as the special advisor for conflict diamonds, which meant mainly I was the representative to the Kimberley process, including in 2012 when the US chaired the Kimberley process, and also worked a lot on conflict minerals. That time period was when Dodd-Frank was introduced, but also the OECD due diligence was developed, the UN guiding principles were developed, and a range of other standards, and I had the opportunity to participate in a lot of those negotiations. Since then, I moved to a law firm. I went to GIA for a year and a half, And then for about the last 6.5 years, I've worked for an NGO called The Century, which evolved out of another organization called the Enough Project. And we focus on the intersection of conflict and corruption, historically mainly on East and Central Africa. So we focus a lot on the DRC, Central African Republic, Sudan, and South Sudan. We're now expanding to cover other parts of the world, including Myanmar, Azerbaijan, and Libya. So kind of broadening the way we integrate financial investigations with policy. So I'm still a senior advisor there part-time. As Christina mentioned, many of you will know that I work also for the Responsible Jewelry Council. I am not representing the Responsible Jewelry Council here today, so I don't really, and so to the extent that any of the discussions that Christina mentioned around Alrosa get into what RJC did and didn't do, I won't be talking about that. So sorry to disappoint if that was the expectation, but save your popcorn for another time, I guess. And I will, but I think that topic and these issues, as Christina mentioned in the introduction, really highlight a lot of other much bigger questions that face the sector. So thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for being here, both of you. Really is a pleasure. So we're going to start kind of broad, and then we'll get more specific as we go. So to kick us off, I'm going to go first to Brad. And then Susan, feel free to jump in, where you'd like. So most of us, as I mentioned in the opener, we've been hearing a lot about Alrosa and the fact that it is part a state-owned entity, and the link between diamond sales funding the current war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is pretty clear. So one thing that we've been curious to understand better is what were some of the earlier red flags around Alrosa that maybe folks weren't paying as close attention to, and now it's right in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I think it's there are two ways to look at that question, right? There's sort of Alrosa itself, and then there's Alrosa's ownership. And I think in terms of Alrosa itself, and I've never been to Alrosa's mining operation. Maybe some of you have. My sense is that Alrosa, at its mining operation, has done a reasonably good job implementing various standards. Alrosa's ownership in other mines like Katoka and Angola, I know Susan's going to talk about extensively. So, that's also a topic I admittedly know much less about. So I'll really defer to her. But I think Angola has been a high risk country in very different ways over the last 20 years. But is that venture is something that would have brought a flag throughout, just in terms of doing business there, and I think it's important throughout. We're talking about high risk and red flags. I think those often then get quickly equated with they shouldn't be doing business there, or you shouldn't be doing business with an entity that is doing business in a place that's high risk and a red flag. And I think that's also something I hope we can get into today, because I think that's also a bit misleading and deceptive. The fact that Alrosa was involved in an Angolan company means companies in the sector should have been asking questions about that and exploring and understanding what was going on and contributing to any potential improvements as were possible, and disclosing that part of the supply chain if they were aware of it. But not necessarily running away. Angola is a pretty fascinating place in terms of what's been happening there. So that's, and Alrosa has also had engagements in Zimbabwe, which, to be honest, I also have followed at a kind of more limited level, which, again, I think I'll defer to Susan on. But then there's the broader scope of the fact that this is a company that has had clear Russian government ownership for a long time, and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights speak clearly about linkages to human rights impacts and linkage comes through profit and comes through the shared ownership and our general understanding of the way you conduct due diligence, know your counterparty, know your customer. It always involves ownership. And so looking at what a state-owned or a partially state-owned entity is doing is important. So that then draws you into things like the Central African Republic, more recently Mali, and the role, and even more broadly Syria, and the Russian government's human rights issues did not start on February 24th, as I think everybody knows. So again, the question then comes into like sort of what do you do about it? So that I think that means that any state-owned entity in any country is going to be a complicated set of questions and due diligence and decision making, and so all these red flags and questions when companies were dealing with Alrosa could have been on the table and probably should have been on the table. They're not easy answers. I mean, because the Russian government was contributing to horrible atrocities in Syria, and the Wagner Group has been propping up in the Central African government regime and committing atrocities of its own, there isn't necessarily a sort of then easy answer to say, okay, I can't deal with Alrosa, because that has a whole other range of implications, which I hope we can get into. But anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to say that there are lots of red flags depending on how you look at what your obligations are to identify those red flags when it comes to a company like Alrosa. And I think the question of what you do with those red flags is ultimately kind of hopefully where the conversation goes today.
I like, Brad, how you kind of separated the ownership of Alrosa and what that contributes to, and how they act in mining. And I do think there are red flags in each of the areas. I mean, and working in government that, Russia was previously considered our strategic enemy, I think, is that the way the government puts it? And, here we are having them on all of the boards of directors and, and in the Kimberley process and kind of everywhere in the business. So I think, and also they have a Russian warship named the Alrosa, and they've been involved in nuclear weapons development or in some way. So there's all of those larger issues that, we could have been looking at, even if Russia wasn't considered a strategic enemy for other countries. For the US, it has been. But if we want to look at what they were doing in the mines themselves, they were acting irresponsibly, and they shouldn't have been considered on all of the different boards and acting within the jewelry industry as a responsible actor. And I say that because they had a responsibility as in their ownership at the Katoka mine to report the tailings pool, the tailings pond spill that went into the Congo River tributary. And they didn't do it, and they chose not to. And that was irresponsible, and it was knowingly irresponsible. And it was, brought to the attention of all of the different organizations where they sat on the boards, and nothing was done within the jewelry industry. So they were acting irresponsibly at their mine, that they knowingly didn't do what they said they would according to the standards and certifications that that they've been a part of and that they've been certified with. So I think we have to look at that red flag. I also think when they go in and with geopolitics and going into Zimbabwe, and although their mine is outside of Marangi, they're working with the Zimbabwe Consolidated Diamond Company, which is a state-owned mining company. So they're investing funds into a company that's state-owned in Zimbabwe, where there are human rights red flags, where there's been problems and continue to be problems in the mining community. So, I think we, as a jewelry industry, really have to look at these red flags of what's really happening, and listen when people bring it to our attention. We can't wait for larger organizations to, say this is the truth according to us. We all have to do our job, because there were red flags with Alrosa.
Maybe we could, before, because both of you laid out kind of a pretty serious opener, and included, already starting hinting at some of the things that we can do going forward. But if we're looking through this lens of sort of shifting the way we do things, having different expectations of the materials that we use in the jewelry industry to make beautiful products that are symbolic of all kinds of different things. As we move through this conversation, to continue considering. So Susan, you were just saying, do your own work, trying to figure out whether or not the company you're doing business with aligns with your values. We can rely on certification systems to an extent to help us kind of perform those evaluations. But why don't you give us, before we go deeper here, give us some of the things that you look for typically when you're checking out supply chains, or when you're looking for tricky situations. What do you look for? What's kind of your process?
For me at this point, I want to know about the mine and what the conditions are for the people in the mining community. And so for diamonds, that really hasn't left me a lot, although I have one diamond coming in the mail from Roots Diamond, which is Martin DeWitt's diamond company. It's going to be a fair trade diamond, and that's going to be the first. So I really want to know not what country it's in, or even what region. I want to know the mine and how it is in the mining community. And not to say that that's going to be perfect. I think a lot of the mines that, aside from some of the fair mined mines in gold, a lot of the mines that I source from aren't going to have like shiny, clean, washed floors like Alrosa's mining facilities probably do. They're not going to look like what we in the West want a certified mine to look like, because I do a lot of ASM sourcing. So I really stopped using diamonds or buying new diamonds. I do use diamonds. I've got certified recycled diamonds on right here. But I stopped using new diamonds of any kind about 5 years ago, maybe longer. And it was really hard because I really liked colored diamonds a lot, and I used them in a lot of my lines that were really big. I also was used really early on the kind of, rustic cut and rose cut diamonds. I had to stop using all of those. So it really, as a jeweler, going back to as a jeweler, how do I source? It really changed the way I sourced when I stopped using and stopped buying any new diamonds.
Mm-hmm. And so let's shift that out. So Brad, your point of view, you're saying you wanted to get more into, how we manage red flags, how we monitor for that. So Susan just gave us some insights from a jeweler's perspective, but when you're monitoring big systems, in context of diamonds and Alrosa and Kimberly process, et cetera, how do you, when you don't have the point of view, that when you don't have the luxury of being able to see this big picture to discern from, what are, the conditions that you're looking at that you think people should be aware of and monitoring as they look at their supply chain?
I guess a couple things. First of all, I appreciate Susan's answer quite a lot because it's very honest and very focused on having a clear objective of what it is she wants her products to represent and be, and to be able to have a sense of everything about them, right? And I think that's ultimately what needs to happen. Look, the entire diamond supply chain is rooted in, we end up in a lot of these conversations talking largely about artisanal mining. Alrosa has given us an opportunity to talk about large scale mining, but like the diamond system, right? It's the supply chain is not set up. You mentioned origin at the beginning, right? It's not set up to provide that information. The site system, the trading system through the main trading centers, the manufacturing center in India, largely, none of it is set up to allow for the transmission of information around what's happening in the supply chain, right? And so that, I think, causes a disconnect between when you're sort of monitoring, if you're monitoring a system, right, and a structure, like what is the diamond supply chain, versus Susan's questions of like, where did this thing come from and who has touched it and what impact has it had? Other than the diamond, I mean, obviously we have a number of folks on here who've done some remarkable work with Moyo and other elements of the colored stone system, which has allowed for a very different kinds of structure. But the diamond structure, diamond system, other than a couple of small programs, just doesn't allow for that. And so until it does, we're sort of doing there's a bit of a sort of disconnect in terms of monitoring like what's happening in different countries and what's happening in different regions. Occasionally, as in like with Petra a couple of years ago, when there was significant violence going on at Petra in Tanzania, which I think is actually a phenomenal example for us to spend some time talking about during the day in terms of how that process evolved and what happened at Petra, or Katoka, as Susan has talked about. So you might occasionally have very specific pieces of information, but mostly you're monitoring this system, and then there's like this rock that shows up, and the two things are not necessarily traveling together. So I think it's one. So for me, for the century, for example, if we're looking at like what's happening in the Central African Republic or the DRC or Dubai and the money laundering sort of, downgrade that it recently got, we can monitor that as a system and say like there is illicit finance, there is corruption, there are human rights violations that are occurring in these places or because of this trade, but it's disconnected from the thing that everyone's talking about. And so I think that's where I've been struggling lately with the question of like, what do you do and what is responsible? Because there's a responsible way to look at the supply chain. And, there are lots of great due diligence tools. And there are lots of great, I said I wouldn't talk about RJC, but, the RJC's Code of Practices guidance document, which is close to 350 pages long, has an extraordinary amount of information in terms of giving you the tools to ask the questions. What is it that I want to monitor? What matters to me? What questions are important? And how do I start to sort of get at where this thing might have come from and what happened along the way? And so I also think it's important to be clear that it's hard to implement 350 pages of guidance. It's hard to implement everything, standards that apply to all issues across the board. It's hard to do that all at once. It's even hard to do that if you're creating something in an oven with like lab-grown diamonds. There's a whole set of other issues that come along the way there, right? So there's no perfect way to do this. There is no perfect diamond or any other product that has no harm and no impact along the way. The question is, how are you monitoring what those harms have been, and how are you thinking about improving along the way and mitigating the impacts that it might have had? And I think the real challenge we have in the diamond sector is that this supply chain is not set up to really allow anybody to do any of that in a meaningful way other than in sort of their own little silo. And so that makes it hard. So anyway, I don't know if I've actually answered the question you even asked me, but
Okay, you did.
That's the way I wrestle with a lot of this stuff. And I think it's at the core of why a lot of reporting about diamonds is so frustrating, is that it's there is this sort of disconnect.
Yeah. It seems appropriate. Christina Mall just asked a question, do you see the disconnect as being able to be repaired, or changed, given the amount of, interest there is in doing so? We're in a different era now than we were when the KP was drafted. We're in a new era of technology. We're in a new era of social media. We're in a new era of wanting to know. We're in a new era of consumer demand. So do any of those factors bode well for the opportunity to design something different?
I mean, there are a lot of people on this call who are better placed to answer that question than me, but I would say, I would say yes and no. I would say yes, that there is a growing level of interest. I would say there are new technologies. I would say technology that allows the transmission of information, not necessarily. I think there's then the illusion that that information then gives you the decisions that you need to make, right? That's true of standards, it's true of blockchain. Like, telling me where something comes from doesn't necessarily tell me much, doesn't tell me what I should do about it, right? It doesn't give me the broader qualitative information. Just like following a certain standard or a certain process doesn't really tell you what you need to do to make hard decisions. But I think the no part is like, look, there's a big, this is true of any supply chain, right? I mean, every industry that's wrestling with this question is wrestling, like these supply chains were not set up to provide information and to provide kind of, other than in exceptional cases, right? They weren't set up to deliver responsible information and responsible impact, right? They were set up to produce something in an efficient, consistent, replicable way. And that's what the site system is. Like the site system that most of the diamond industry works on at a large scale. And then the way diamonds are ultimately sorted and traded is to be able to deliver to the consumer a consistent product of a certain size and color and quality that they can then buy. And the entire trade is set up, right? When you go to different trading centers and different manufacturers, they're working along with, sometimes decades but at least, equipment and a trading system that is focused on, a half carat yellow at a certain grade that is going to then sort of that's their market. Their market isn't responsibly sourced diamonds, other than an exception. So I think until the whole supply chain, this is what happened with the KP. The whole supply chain did come together and say, we need to do something. What they did ultimately was not sufficient. But I think it requires a whole of the supply chain assessment, and that's super hard. And that requires a lot of economic interest to sort of get to the table and say, what can we do to do this better? And I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if it's possible in any sector. Anyway, so let me stop.
Let's put that out there though as a big question for today's discussion. And so I'd like to go back to Susan and see, I'm curious, Susan, what you'd like to add at this point, or if you want to go into a little bit of a specific example where conflict looks different than what we typically understand the definition to be. So with Kotoka, it's environmental conflict as an environmental. So you might respond to where Brad was going, and then we could go into the next conversation.
I will. I want to talk about like what a day in the life of going in and out of Marangi looks like right now in Zimbabwe. But so much to think about there with Brad, everything that you were saying. I think we need to talk about reforms and in the industry. And what I've been kind of coming to the conclusion in my mind about is that, first of all, as I started, I feel like the jewelry industry thinks the geopolitics are glamorous, working in governments and ownership of mines and governments. And we've been told that this is responsible because if you give government ownership in a mine, then they get taxes. Well, they can get taxes if an individual has a mine there as well, and an individual that's a national in that country. So I would like to see the geopolitics and the state-owned companies out, and I'd like to stop thinking that that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing. That's my opinion. I don't think it's a good thing for a diamond mine or a gold mine to, be building up partnerships. And when if you look at the list of corrupt governments, and then you look at the list of state-owned mines, there's a huge alignment right there. You can look at those graphs side by side. It's just not right, in my opinion. And then the other thing I think we need to do to clean up the industry as far as who's on boards is to, so you can see who's there, is actually to not go with corporations that have multiple shell companies in Panama and Bahamas and British Virgin Islands and all those places. So those are some simple reforms that I've been putting out there, and I would like to see. And the other thing is, let's stop having the industry people and the money telling us what's responsible, and let's start thinking more about third-party certification. I mean, what about SCS? What about, actual fair trade, organizations? Go ahead and do outside certifications. We shouldn't be like self-certifying our, as an industry in that way. So, so those are some, I think, reforms that I would think would be really helpful. And I can't, I can't remember, there was so much to talk on there, but if you want, Christina, I can tell you, the day in the life in Morangi, because I discussed this with a lot of women before we came on.
Yeah, let's do one kind of closing out that conversation before we move on. So there's definitely some conversation happening in the chat. Folks are curious to get their hands on the guidance that the Responsible Jewelry Council makes available for free. So you'll find that link on there if you haven't noticed. Christina Viegas wanted to share that she is in disagreement that state-owned mines are necessarily no-goes automatically. So maybe we can, later on in the discussion, we might circle back to that. So we're kind of having this big open thing. Now we want to get into some of the specific examples in countries where we're seeing, so two things here. One, the civil society organizations that make up the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition have long been making the case, as has the US government, as have others, that conflict is too narrowly defined to actually protect human rights. In fact, human rights aren't included in the definition. So in work that we did with the KPCSC last year, one of the variations of conflict would include environmental. It includes human rights, obviously. And so the next piece is how do we expand that definition so that we can understand the role that diamonds play in causing, supporting, financing, et cetera, conflict in other countries, and what does it look like? So Susan, you did some legwork prior to coming to make sure we had the latest information about the group of women in Morangi that you've been working with. So this is a deep dive now into what conflict can look like. And it's important to keep in mind that these diamonds too also are making their way to market, despite boycotts against it, despite other arrangements. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the message you've been helping to bring?
Okay, and I will just mention, since we're talking so much about sanctions, that I don't think the U.S. Diamond interest has done anything to stop the flow of Zimbabwe diamonds into the U.S., although they've been sanctioned for a long time. The industry just blatantly ignores that because of the system, but I think there's many reasons. So I was talking with many people in the community recently in Morangi, and there have been improvements there. And I think maybe part of that is we had a petition about stopping sexual violence that was happening in this circumstance. So it's like living in a prison. So say you're going to visit your sister and she's in a different village in Morangi. When you go there, if you drive, you may have to go through 7 checkpoints of soldiers and police guarding that area. One woman that drives can afford food, and when the soldiers come to ask for bribes, they say, "We're starving, give us something." So now she takes bread and she's giving that to the soldiers because they're not being fed. So you're getting asked for bribes when you come through from soldiers. Now, many people come through the bus and you have to show an identity card, even to visit your sister, even to go, if in Morangi, to travel. There's no freedom of movement, which is a basic human right. So if you go in by bus and you don't have money, if you don't have a card, you can be taken anytime that you're caught traveling, even if you go to the bath. This is only the 7 guards or more stations that get put up. Even if you go to the bathroom at night and your bathroom is outside of your house, or you go to fetch water and you don't have your identity card on you, you get put in the prison. The prison is a chain link fence outside in the elements, and the men are in one chain link fence area and the women are in the other. There are some old dusty tents that have been there, I guess people say forever, just a few tents. You're given water. You're there for 3 days. And if you can't pay to get out, which most people can't pay to get out. So you're given water, and you have to pay to get food. So if you don't have money for food, then you're in this outside chain link fence for 3 days with no food. That's right now in Marangi. And when Kimberley Process Civil Society went through, and when the Zimbabwe Human Rights Group went through, all of the guards vanished and there was only one checkpoint. So that's happening now. The jail still exists. 2 years ago, after the Symposium on Human Rights, we put out a petition because the only way that women could get out of that jail, if they didn't have money, was to be raped. So that is currently that jail, which is being outside in the elements and maybe not eating for 3 days if you don't have money, is what exists in Marangi if you don't have your identity card on you when you go to visit your sister, or go outside to go to the bathroom or get water. And these diamonds are everywhere.
And how are the women supporting each other right now?
Our group has over 50 women that have a WhatsApp movement, lines that we're all on. I'm the only American on. They support each other in with Marangi Women's Alliance. They've had groups going into the community, giving out flyers on the Zimbabwe Constitution, talking to women who need help. We've been supported by the jewelry industry. Thank you, everyone who donates to Marangi Women's Alliance. We'll be donating the proceeds from today, actually, to help a gift basket for a young woman who's, she's under 16. I think she's 14, maybe 15 now. And she's been abused by local artisanal miners. And yeah, she's severely disabled, and her mom's kind of given up. Now she's pregnant, so we're doing a basket with food and clothes for the baby, and Marangi Women's Alliance will go and support that way. So that we've done that where there's been victims of gender-based violence, where we do support baskets. They're court advocates. So when the elders in the community recently were jailed for a peaceful protest against the Anjin mine, which is part military owned by Zimbabwe, part Chinese owned, Marangi Women's Alliance will do things like go to court and bring, this is something else the jewelry industry has been supporting through Responsible Jewelry Transformative, is we give, enough money so you can take snacks and food and go to court. And sometimes it's just that. Sometimes it's, hand-holding, women, peer-to-peer support. And there's nothing like that peer-to-peer support. I mean, just, so that's it. And then on the WhatsApp group, actually our chairperson, Billy, took a class from Human Rights Watch with Joe Becker, had a separate class, and took a class on reporting. So we have some extremely skilled reporters in this organization. And through WhatsApp, there's a way for people to report human rights incidents, whether it's, or just report somebody that maybe needs support. But really, I can't underscore how isolated this community is because of diamonds. And they want everyone here to know that even with the millions, and I just looked, there's just a new report maybe yesterday morning on how many more millions in diamonds is coming, and there's no ambulance in Marangi. I mean, where diamonds do good, why don't we get this community an ambulance? Women are dying on the way to childbirth. There's no way for them to get there with all the checkpoints and no ambulance. And so, yeah, that's, I know that's a lot, but there's a lot there. And we're just sitting here talking about, what good diamonds do, but we can't even help the women that, are our peers too, living in this community.
Yeah. Um, and I think in part, this is what we're getting at when it comes to these conversations about due diligence too, how you can, you can read a website from a mining company and it might kind of sound pretty rosy. They report on the benefits that they're providing a community. They're reporting on their commitments to, mitigating impacts to the land. They talk about, supporting new business ventures in the communities where they are located. But in the case of Merengue, we go and we have a specific example like Susan is sharing, and you wouldn't get that information through typical channels of doing your due diligence. So I'd like to go back to Brad a second. You've been watching these kinds of initiatives where the diamond industry has opportunities to implement programs that are potentially beneficial in the development of schools or the support of business enterprise or increasing access to international markets for local citizens, et cetera. But there's a great shyness about telling some of the harder truths. And in one of your more recent communications, you shared that you're really encouraging companies to be transparent about what's going on. What do they know? What don't they know? And what are they doing about it? Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And first of all, thank you to Susan for sharing all of that information and those stories and for staying involved. I had the opportunity to visit Merengue through the KP many, many years ago, and it's heartbreaking to hear the continued situation there. And my applaud those who have stayed connected, and the work that Susan is doing. So I think a few things on that, and in some ways, what Susan talked about is a good frame for it. So the first is, yeah, I mean, my main focus and a lot of what I've been writing about recently is about honesty, which is which can be hard to do because it requires just a level of complexity and nuance and constancy that is not necessarily easy to implement or that manageable. But you know, the point of that diamonds. I mean, first of all, the idea that diamonds do good. I don't want to throw them or any other particular organization more directly under the bus or something. But this is about people, right? We are like the diamonds. Diamonds are rocks, right? They come out of the ground. This is about the industry and the people, and we are all making choices about what we do and how we conduct ourselves in this industry and this supply chain. So it is about the people in the diamond industry and whether or not we are doing good or we are doing bad. And I think the first point is the idea that it is one or the other, right? Like all of these things can be true. The diamond industry can be engaged in a place and contributing to development, and it can also be directly or indirectly contributing to abuses. Both of those things are possible, and frankly, both of those things are usually true in one way or another. And it is important, and certainly in a world of marketing and short attentions, et cetera, it can be hard to sort of convey that. But that's ultimately what needs to happen in order for negative press and negative implications, and ultimately, frankly, negative bad things to continue to happen. There has to be an acknowledgement that the negative side goes along with the positive, all at once and all the time, right? And these are not fixed situations. A company is not necessarily sort of responsible or certifiable or sustainable or ethical all the time, every day, in a fixed manner. It's constantly changing, and the risks are constantly changing. And hopefully the situation on the ground in Zimbabwe improves. If the situation in Merengue improved in a month and somebody found a lot of articles about how terrible something is in Zimbabwe. Like, it's hard to keep up with all of the information, but that's what ultimately has to happen. Is that we have to be thinking much more about process than result, right? Honesty is about, and transparency is about, what are you doing, what's happening, what's good, what's bad, what are you trying to improve on, and where are you trying to get to? And showing your work, basically, as in if you're doing a math equation. This is the end I'm trying to get to, and this is how I'm getting there. And some of it's good and some of it's bad. And some of it I can control, some of it I can't control. A diamond company can't necessarily impact a lot of what Susan described. I mean, the broader, as Christina Villegas is talking about in the chat, like, a diamond company can't disrupt the Central Intelligence Organization of Zimbabwe. It just can't. Maybe it could have an impact here and there around the edges, but that's a structure that is much bigger. A problem that Alrosa has is, like, Alrosa can't stop the war in Ukraine, right? It's just beyond what Alrosa is capable of. So the companies dealing with Alrosa can be honest about the fact that we're dealing with a company who is a part of this much bigger structure and system that it actually has no reasonable level of control over. So that's what we have to get to. That's hard. It's hard to explain. It's hard to, but because it's hard doesn't mean that's not where we should go and what we should be doing. And that's also part of educating NGOs and the media and others who consume this information, because I understand companies are leery of reporting things that sound negative, because then that turns into an article that Diamond Company X is contributing, committing human rights violations on the ground. Like, that's also, we in civil society make plenty of mistakes, and we oversimplify and we over dramatize at times, for sure. That's part of the honesty that I think ultimately is needed, is an honest conversation. It's due diligence and being public about what due diligence is being conducted, so that stakeholders understand and can be a part of the process. It's not, an easily turned in, it's hard to turn that into an SOP that, like, somebody in your team can just implement. It's a bigger picture, it's a decision, it's a strategy. And I just want to highlight for a second, sorry, I know I'm rambling again, but the example I mentioned of Petra Diamonds, I don't know how closely people have followed this, but this is a good example of a company that in Tanzania at the Williamson mine, its security personnel were responsible for horrific acts of violence, deaths, rapes, injuries, you name it. And this is a company that often, I think ended up in, earlier iterations in discussions of companies that were doing well. And, here in Tanzania, Tanzania is a complicated place in terms of its political situation. So it's hard to define, but I think ultimately Tanzania and Petra probably went in the category, if you were just trying to say, like, is this good or bad, probably more on the good side. And then bad stuff happens, really bad stuff happens. And it could have been pretty easy, I think, for boycott Tanzania or boycott Petra kinds of campaigns to have occurred. Ultimately, RAID, along with a number of other NGO, RAID's a UK NGO, along with others, reported on this publicly, engaged the company, and the company, sure enough, was very public about, we made mistakes and bad things happened, and we are going to try to deal with them. And they have been dealing with them, and they ultimately reached a legal settlement. And the discussion, it's hard, and it was very painful to sort of read about along the way. And there's a lot of monitoring that needs to keep going on, but there's a lot of positives that come out of that. And I think the idea that at any point, a kind of discussion that we're often having these days is, should I source from Williamson or not? Should I source from Petra or not? And on some days, the answer probably to that was maybe no. But then pretty quickly, the answer might have been, well, yes, because here's what they're trying to do. And so I think ultimately what I'm trying to get at is the idea that we often have these conversations with the idea that there is some new standard or some new term or some new process that is just going to tell us what to do. And I think my view on all of this is that we need to go in the opposite direction and get much more back to process and continuous improvement, and setting your objectives, setting your strategy on what you want to achieve, and realizing that you can't then achieve that in a week or a month. You can say, this is the kind of company I want to be, and you're probably maybe never going to get there, but what you're selling is your effort. What you're selling is your process. Everybody here is probably trying to make the perfect piece of jewelry, and you probably have come really close, but you're never quite going to get there. But you're striving to achieve some ideal of beauty and perfection in your product, and the same thing should be true in the process you have to achieve to source your stuff.
Yeah.
Stop there.
Yeah, so there's a really busy chat going on in addition to what you're saying. So I think generally this audience is very much a group in favor of continuous improvement, in favor of honesty, and in favor of disclosures. But there's still a line in the sand that needs to be drawn at some point. I will or I won't purchase this for this reason. And so one of the, people are pointing out again, in this particular case, the way that Alrosa is owned 33% by the Russian Federation, another 33% by the region of the country where the mining is actually taking place, and the rest variable ownership models. The ties to violence are inscrutable, right? You can't ignore it. And so is this one of those moments where the conflict is in fact the line in the sand? And people, of course, we're having the US government is imposing sanctions. It sees a real link to it. But from this process point of view, there is a moment where the line has to be drawn.
So let me, yes and no, which is maybe going to be a surprising answer for me. But I think the idea, your main point that there is a line is right. Like in all the process I'm talking about, like at some point people have to make decisions on what that line is, right? Like the idea that a process or a compliance system or a set of standards is going to give you an answer of what that line is wrong. Like the idea, the due diligence is meant to help you figure out what that answer is. Now, of course, there are some issues and some problems and concerns that the international community, and I think all of us on this call would agree, are red lines. Forced labor, slavery, war crimes, torture, those should be lines. And sanctions makes it even harder, makes it even clearer, because then it becomes a sort of something you can be penalized for and maybe prosecuted for. So on one hand, yes, there is a clear line. On the other hand, I say no because I think every one of those, any line comes with consequences, right? So if you were a jeweler whose entire product line is based on Alrosa production, it's hard to say this is the line, because then you don't have products. And that is something you have to think about. Like at the end of the day, do you close because that line has been met? Or do you charge your consumers 4 times the amount for what you have because now you have no more inventory or stock? The concern we've read about that the Indian government keeps raising about, hundreds of thousands of cutters are going to lose their jobs. Like that's not a relevant factor. It needs to be considered. So I think the idea that there's a line that's crossed and then there's a switch that just either goes on and on, source, don't source. That's what I think is problematic. So anyway, I need to run to the door. I'll be right back.
So I just want to add real quick. I definitely see Brad's point there, and I think that it is more focused on, or it's coming from this perspective of more like, is there a blanket statement or a blanket standard or something that we can all turn to that gives us that line, right? Where I think a lot of us here in this community of concerned jewelers approach things more from a way of how do we draw our own line. And that will be different for everybody. And it goes back to kind of what Susan had mentioned earlier of she looks at where does this come from specifically so that she can make the decision based on her own values framework of the impacts that this purchase might have. So I do think that that line in the sand can be different for people based on their own moral and ethical frameworks. And that isn't necessarily about relying on a standard. And Susan, I see you unmuted, so I didn't mean to speak for you in that way, but that's how I understood your point earlier. And that's how I see my own sourcing decisions as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, I think sometimes when we, hear people talking in the way that, this large capacity and, framing it that way, that this is so difficult and cloud. And I don't think for, definitely the majority of people on the call today, it needs to be that way. And it can be hard choices, and it can be, like I said earlier, all right, I'm not going to use this type of diamond anymore. I'm only going to use certified recycled. People can make those choices. Large companies, small companies, they can make that choice. I mean, to go to a different area and talk about gold, Fairmind's been asking larger, higher capacity groups to work with them for 2 years, up until this, this is happening. We'll grow with you. So people just have to make the decision. And yes, charge the consumer more. Jewelry should be precious. It doesn't need to be mass produced out there so that everybody gets the biggest gold diamond ring that they can possibly have. Maybe that's not the way of the future. I mean, it should be precious. It should be special. If, it's the same thing in any other supply chain you look at. You just have to make the decision. And in the jewelry industry seems to think that it's more important than other supply chains. I mean, we just have to say, we're not the whole geopolitics. It's just, I'm, obviously fed up with that. It doesn't, we're not so important that we can't say we will not, source Russian diamonds just to go back there. I mean, you've got Antwerp saying we're going to do it because everybody else is doing it. And India's already, talking about the cutting in India. India had already made these agreements, these big agreements with Russia to be importing more. You have all these different hubs where people are going to continue to funnel diamonds because it's what's best for them. And then they're citing all these other reasons for their own countries. And we just have to say no as individuals. I everybody here, and maybe it comes down to, just doing the right thing. Let's just do the right thing. And for larger companies as well, we can change our supply chains. I think when I first started with diamonds, the Human Rights Symposium 2 years ago, and really first started talking with Kimberly Process Civil Society and Human Rights Watch on these things, I couldn't beforehand. I'm like, oh, this is really strange. Like they're not talking to the jewelry industry, and there was this, and I'm like, that's weird. What's going on here? Is this an accident? Well, it was so intentional to keep the jewelry industry separate than the diamond industry. And the whole, the whole kind of veil, in the past 2 years, this curtain's been coming, been opening now, right? That everyone's kind of seen that. I think we need to separate ourselves sometimes for some of these suppliers and look at them as separate than us and evaluate them. Make our decisions that way on our own, because there's been too much influence.
Yeah. I'd like to interject here with something. We have about 20 more minutes to navigate through this conversation, and a glaring hole, that Susan did a great job, conferring with her peers in Moringa and being able to bring their story. But we, have the glaring hole in that we're not hearing from communities directly that are impacted by diamonds, right? That continues to be a huge problem. So, maybe we could put in the link to Cecilia and Anna, if we could put in the link to what the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition arrived at after a year of really looking hard at what they wanted to say to the jewelry industry, where they felt like as organizations, they needed support. And then there's new information, there's a longer list even that I recently saw. The organization Zella, which is the Zimbabwean Environmental Law Association, they're part of the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition, and they also recently put together some points that they want communicated out into the diamond and jewelry industries about what their expectations are on the ground. And I think that is one of the core elements that we have to be working toward as clearly the desire for change exists. Clearly there is momentum for this change. Clearly we have new tools available that allow us to do these things. And so we should be able to better work in collaboration with communities on the ground that, we see stories on a regular basis, whether it's industrial scale mining and the blasting continues to occur, people's villages weren't moved as they were promised, and their buildings are cracking when the blasting is occurring to mine, or the students can't study at that time because their classroom fills with dust, and they're not able to breathe in those moments. Like, that is the reality of diamond mining at the moment. I'm laughing because it's not because I think it's funny. I'm laughing because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. And yet these are high value materials that make their way to markets. We pay a heck of a lot of money for them, and the benefits are not yet reaching those most impacted. So Susan, if you want to speak to that a moment, and then we'll go to Brad for a little bit more insight on that.
Excuse me, can I come in? I've been trying to come in for hours now. Okay.
Sure, Angus.
Thank you. What I think, I want to take up what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, this is now big headlines everywhere, and it's quite obvious that the diamond industry in Russia is funding this conflict. And if we need to look at the supply chains and to see whether these supply chains are in fact funding conflict through the processes of the companies operating there. If we take Israel, for instance, there is no doubt that the processing of diamonds there, processing of rough diamonds, cutting them and polishing them, is generating a vast amount of revenue, which is then being used in the conflict with Palestine, has been for many, many years. And we've been talking about, it's difficult to pin things down. If we're talking about conflict, we actually have figures from the United Nations. Since 2008, there have been a lot of fatalities in the conflict, in the context of the occupation and the conflict between Palestine and Palestinians and Israelis. The latest figures, I looked them up today, is that since 2008, there have been the following number of fatalities. Not totally funded by any means, of course, by the revenue from governments, but substantially funded by this revenue. The figures are Palestinian fatalities, 6,014 since 2008. Israeli fatalities, 265. And a lot of those fatalities of Palestinians, well over 1,000, are children. And this is a similar situation, extraordinarily parallel to what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is at the moment only partially under occupation, whereas Palestinian territories have been under occupation, I think, for 54 years by now. So, and yet the garment industry is marketing its garments as conflict-free. Well, they are certainly not conflict-free by these definitions.
Can I jump in on, sorry to interrupt you, Angus. Can I jump in on this quickly and then maybe go back to Susan for the question that Christina answered, if that's okay? Or Anna, did you want to go in a different direction?
Yeah, I was going to respond to Angus as well. And Brad, you can go ahead and do that first. That's fine. Look, and I had something to say too.
I mean, I've been an anti-occupation activist for 25 years and lived in the West Bank, lived in northern Israel, and have looked at this really closely. And I think it's, I think this one gets to, I mean, and Sean, who's been certainly a long time activist on this as well, who I've had a number of exchanges with over the years, I think this gets into one of those questions of the lines. And I think it is more challenging to think through tax revenue as of private companies to a government that is doing harm. Because if that's the case, then, you know, no government provides more assistance to the Israeli government than the US. So my tax dollars are also contributing to that. So, and I have not made the decision that contributing those tax dollars or supporting other companies in the US who also provide tax dollars that result in billions of dollars to support the occupation is the right way to approach it. And I also don't necessarily think that there is a clear line on that. I think it's fair to say that other companies might do well to be educated on the situation there, but there's not a clear line on that, and I don't think. And implying that there is, I think, then ultimately sort of undermines the effort to actually educate people about what's happening and where things go. And I think if we're talking about tax revenue that goes to governments that do things that we disagree with, I think that shuts down most of our participation in the capitalist system, to be honest. So I think we have to be just clear about that. I think it's fair to understand what's happening in Israel, just as it's understand what's happening vis-a-vis the US government and in every other part of the supply chain. If you are purchasing diamonds that are 95% of them are manufactured in India, not only are the conditions in those factories, I mean, most of them are quite good, not all of them are, and the Indian government itself is involved in any number of human rights violations and other kinds of issues that we should all be concerned about. All of this is to say that it doesn't mean that we shut the entire industry down once one part of the supply chain is engaged in problem. What I'm trying to get at all along is, yeah, all of these things should be on your thought process, and everyone should be drawing lines about what they think, where they think the lines are, and not look away from them and not be afraid to say, this is a line I'm not willing to draw on. And ultimately, as Susan has said, quite bravely say, that's a line I'm not going to go past. I think that's where ultimately we need to be in conversation about this stuff. So anyway, Anna, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So what I was going to say was pretty aligned with your response. And the way I think of it, I like how you brought it back to the lines that we draw. And the way I personally think about it, which may be helpful to some others in their decision making, is about direct impacts or secondary impacts, right? So when we see very direct connections and very direct impacts to things that we disagree with and that we stand against, then it becomes a little more clear, the decisions that we can make. Whereas when we start dealing with these secondary impacts like tax revenue, as Brad mentioned, it becomes even harder to make those decisions and even more muddied in a space that is already so opaque, and that we're already dealing with so many issues that we're navigating. So yeah, we're happy to have that point brought up and discuss it. And it does come back to we're all here deciding how we make those ethical decisions as jewelers and what lines we draw for ourselves. And Christina, I think I wanted to bring it back to your question that you wanted to bring up. So
can I just say there that individuals may make their own ethical decisions, but the industry must be honest. And when it says that these diamonds are conflict free, and that
yes,
from the whole process through from mine to final market, the person buying them, etc., they're conflict free, this is just a pure lie throughout
right,
the industry,
Angus,
and it is not acceptable.
I agree on the conflict-free claim. If you have, if you're not familiar with the KPCSC calls to action that we have shared, there's a link in the chat. One of those calls to action is for the industry to abandon conflict-free marketing claims, which we agree with and stand behind. So thank you. Christina?
Yeah, so I'd like to move us in, appropriately, the chat is going to like, okay, so how do we do this practically? How do we do it? If there are, we, Anna and I, and Cecilia, are generally in the United States. Susan is in the US, Brad is in the US. And so, we're dealing with our own government's behaviors internationally and trying to understand them. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, we're appreciative in this particular case that the US government has clearly drawn some lines in terms of sanctions on Alrosa diamonds. However, because our system relies so heavily on other countries, folks want to talk about Belgium. What do we do? Do we have, the support we need to even meet the law, meet the requirements of the law? So Cristina Viegas, would you like to hop on a second and just bring it back to that point of, some ideas for what we might change? Are you available?
Yeah, didn't plan. I was just usually active in the chat per usual. But yeah, I think one thing you said up front, Christina Miller, is that unless we know the origin of diamonds, how can we possibly say anything about their responsibility level? And how can jewelers of any size be a part of a change and create that demand signal, saying we reject certain kinds of diamonds, or we want these kinds of diamonds, unless the folks in the middle are actually segregating or tracing. It seems to me, and I do traceability all day long, that the diamond industry keeps claiming that it's exceptional, that this is hard. But in fact, everything I know about diamonds is actually pretty straightforward to do segregation, except for melee, which we can all agree is difficult. So I'm wondering, just practically, we can all agree we want segregated diamonds, and we can all agree we want origin. But how does that happen? And so one thing that Sarah, you said in the chat is that really won't happen until the big players, maybe the Signets or the others, start demanding that of the mid chain, which is in Belgium. But I was wondering what else practically needs to happen for that to actually happen. because from a traceability perspective, it's actually not that hard. We just need the will and some basic upgrading of traceability systems.
Thank you. We're going to expand that. I just want to remind everyone, if you're not, if we haven't sort of gone to you to talk, if you could please stay muted, it would be really helpful to have the clearest recording we can get. Thanks. Susan Wheeler, do you want to comment on how, with regard to our reliance on these larger systems?
Yeah, and I said that Christine had mentioned, I was in the chat, I'm not good at typing and writing at the same time, and I mentioned Antwerp, and I think that, Antwerp's been for processing diamonds, and as, a hub for diamonds to come through, is really, the one that we want to rely on for doing the responsible thing. They've been working on insurances, and I think that they have been working towards that, and we don't want to lose that. But on the other hand, I think that they need to, say no to processing diamonds that they don't know whether or not, are from a Russian mine or a Russian-owned mine. And we don't seem to have, as the U.S., we should be having the organizations that are U.S. organizations coming out and saying, we understand that, you're doing the right thing, but the right thing right now would be to stop bringing in any diamonds you don't know the origin of. And that's just, I think that we need more lines drawn, and it's disappointing. And I know, Christina's been talking about the deafening silence for so long. It's disappointing that larger industries aren't going to do that, but we just have to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with all of that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the supply chain, I mean, it would be, the supply chain involves, it involves a number of big players along the way. There are a few very large mining companies that need to begin the system. GIA as a lab has a program of kind of integrating origin in various parts of its grading system. That needs to be expanded as a way of actually being able to document along the way scientifically. You've been hinting at, blockchain and Everledger and those kinds of solutions. There's probably ways that happens, but at the end of the day, the largest trading center is Dubai and the largest cutting center is India. Dubai has recently become the largest, and India is by orders of magnitude, right? And so, and I think, as we know from we know from the electronics world, from cocoa, because the end consumer or the end or large companies at the end of the supply chain say they want something different, it doesn't mean that the upstream is going to change. It's certainly not going to change overnight. It takes a long level of engagement, and time and patience and investment in transitioning those systems, right? And so segregation is possible, sure, but to overhaul the way the supply chain works is going to be, a very long time, and a lot of investment and a lot of education and a lot of patience. And so, to me, what we can do practically is actually set up the infrastructure that allows that process to happen. I think saying that, like, here's the way the supply chain needs to work, I think that's a mistake. I don't know that we know what the supply chain needs to look like. I know it shouldn't just be tinkering with what we have now, but I don't know that we know what it should be in the end. I think we need the stakeholders across the supply chain to be able to come together in a way that they did in Kimberley in 2000, to say we have to stop the conflict diamond problem. And the solution at the time developed to sort of solve that particular problem with the technology and the level of awareness that existed at the time wasn't a terrible one. It just hasn't adapted to where we are 20 some years later. I think you need something like that again. I think some group of stakeholders need to call the industry together, and we don't have someone in the figure of Nelson Mandela who was harder for people to turn away from, but we need someone along those lines to sort of bring the industry together and say, like, the current system doesn't work for what it needs to deliver. And we need to change it. It's hard to have that conversation when every week you read in the trade press that the jewelry industry is raking in money, right? And so, like, if the jewelry industry was about to collapse, then sure, everybody's happy to get together and have this conversation. But, like, that's not the economic and financial reality most companies are. So when you're asking large companies and the industry as a whole to sort of overhaul itself while it's super profitable, again, at a large scale, I know many companies are actually struggling, but it's hard politically. It's why countries that are stronger in a conflict don't usually come to the table and say, here's how I'm going to give you up all my strength. That's not how things work. And I don't think it's the way it works in business either. And it's, and I mentioned, I know we're running out of time, but I would really urge people to look up recent cases around the cocoa sector. There's a lawsuit that's been brought by an NGO against Hershey and the Rainforest Alliance for their sustainability claims. Nestle has a class action lawsuit against it in California related to its advertising around its sustainability and ethics claims. And the cocoa industry has been wrestling with this stuff for as long, and in some ways is arguably actually simpler for the cocoa industry based on the way it's structured. But it's hard, and that industry also needs to sort of overhaul itself. And there are dozens of others. And so I think it's okay that the jewelry industry is in this place. Lots of sectors are, and I think I think if the idea of like what we do is not the end, but actually like what we need to do is actually come together and figure out what it is we actually need to do and who needs to be in that room and how are we going to get. It's not, maybe you can get Signet and De Beers and Rio and probably someday even Alrosa, but you need Rosy Blue and Dairoff and Eurostar and then all that's cutters smaller than them, and you need everybody who is in the Almas Towers in Dubai. Like, those are the actors that need to really change their approach. And until the profitability changes, I don't know how that happens other than people demanding of it. And that's what everybody on this call and elsewhere can be a part of.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's just that, Brad, I don't believe I hate being cynical because everyone knows that I'm not. I'm like that person addicted to hope, but the door has just been shut so many times from the larger responsible organizations, from the larger organizations in the industry, from the diamond industry, to not only people that are caring about their supply chain and using diamonds, to not only jewelers that aren't, the big wigs, but also to civil society. And, I know there is Kimberly Process Civil Society, and it is fantastic. And, I hope that just keeps on growing stronger and stronger. But the realities are that the people in the rooms behind the doors keep those doors shut. And I don't see them opening up those doors. I don't see them attending or listening in on conversations that are talking about things like the Katoka River spill. They don't show up. They don't want to hear it. And a lot of the organizations that are out there doing good don't want to hear about these things. And I know, I totally agree with your recent blog post and talking about the transparency, but until they open up the doors and, really have inclusive conversations, I don't know how we're going to get to a transparent place or make real change.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Brad. Thanks everyone that has been so active in the chat. This has been a really educational session. As always, there is requests for more information. We have similar issues with gold. Trust me. We've been talking about this all for a very long time. And so one thing I would like to do in this call to have further conversation on diamonds, in our takeaways that we publish every time we have a living room, which is monthly, we do a summary of the conversation that happened so that the information is really accessible, and we try to document the various themes that came up during it. let's add to this one a form for folks to fill out privately if they are interested in being part of a deeper dialogue on diamonds, and we'll see where it goes from there. We know that it's going to be complicated depending on who we feel like we need to have in the room, but multi-stakeholder is one of the key wishes. I want to share my screen for a second. And it is just to put in front of you, again, the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition's point of view. And so I know there is, I've seen some concerns raised that the coalition doesn't come out and speak on this issue, or the coalition could do better speaking on this issue. Even our US jewelry industry press tends to criticize the coalition. So two things that are important to know as you evaluate this information. One is they are observers to the KP. They do not have voting power. Their influence is very limited. Two, these are civil society organizations, for the most part, on the African continent. They are representing people in all struggling with all different issues. Diamonds are often a teeny tiny element of the entire scope of their work. And they represent, in some cases, labor, in some cases, environment, in some cases, land use, et cetera. So this is a short list of things that the Kimberley Process came up with last fall that they wanted to communicate to the industry, which was abandon conflict-free marketing claims, right? Sure, according to the KP definition, the facts are, if you use this limited definition that it defines, you could say that there is a large number of diamonds that are conflict-free. But if you apply a definition of conflict that is more in tune to human rights, that is more in tune to environmental grievances, et cetera, you cannot say that those stones are conflict-free. Therefore, we honor this. Second, and we are, we could have done better in today's conversation and always commit to doing better in the future, but we are here talking about diamond affected communities, not entirely without talking with them. Susan, again, thank you for bringing the message. Christina Villegas, you're with communities on a regular basis. We are also intersecting. We have others on the call that do work regularly with impacted communities. So we can do better, but as a whole, this needs to be more of a commitment. Implementing due diligence on diamond supply chains. This has been one of the key conversations today. And finally, this one is a really touchy one, whether or not the World Diamond Council's revised systems of warranties are actually doing what they should be doing. Yes, it's a tool that is available, but it does not hold participating companies to mandatory human rights commitments, right? It suggests that they should be, but it is not mandatory. And this is why we continue to hold in question some of these initiatives as well. We know it's hard, but people are tired of it. And I appreciate that we've had diverse points of view on this particular session, which we usually do. And I want to thank you all for being here today, for contributing to the chat. And I want to wish you all on a different tone and a different note. For anyone that's observing, have a wonderful holiday. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Next month in May, we're going to be doing a little bit of a back to basics living room session. We're really hoping that you can invite folks that are less well versed in these topics for beginner kind of intro level conversations on general knowledge about things to consider, when it comes to your supply chain. So invite folks to come. As Anna mentioned, it will be on May 20th, the third Friday of every month. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Brad and Susan and everyone participating. Take care, y'all.
Thank
Great
you.
seeing you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Everybody.